Under a moonlit sky, the old man hobbled through the forgotten cemetery, its crumbling gravestones whispering tales of the past. He carried a lantern, its flickering light casting uneasy shadows on the frostbitten ground. He wasn't searching for peace. He was calling out to lost friends, long buried. As his trembling voice echoed through the graveyard, the air grew heavier. Unseen shadows gathered behind him, coiling like smoke, ready to follow him home into the abyss of his past sins. The wind whistled through the cemetery, its mournful tune weaving between gravestones. Under a pale crescent moon, the old man shuffled forward, his lantern casting trembling light onto the frostbitten path. This was no ordinary visit. Tonight he was searching for something, or perhaps someone, buried long ago. The cemetery was old, its gravestones crooked and weathered by time. He paused by a stone with faded carvings. "Thomas," he whispered, his voice barely carrying in the still air. "Are you here? Do you still remember me?" The silence was oppressive, yet he continued. "Liam, do you remember the pond, the woods? I can still hear our laughter." The wind shifted, carrying a faint, almost imperceptible sound. His heart skipped. It wasn't the rustling of leaves, but something eerily familiar, like laughter, distant and hollow. He froze, the lantern trembling in his grip. The cemetery felt alive in the worst way, its shadows shifting as though watching him. The old man's memories pulled him further into the graveyard. He recalled long summers spent with his childhood friends. They were inseparable, a band of mischief-makers running wild through fields and woods. But time had been cruel. One by one, they'd all left him behind, their lives snuffed out like candles in a storm. He had hoped tonight, under the moon's watchful eye, to feel close to them again, if only for a moment. "I just want to talk," he said, louder now, but his voice faltered as the shadows deepened. The lantern's flame flickered, casting shapes that danced unnaturally against the ground. He pressed on, drawn to a forgotten section overrun with moss and vines. Stopping before a grave, he traced its inscription with trembling fingers. "Henry Calloway," he murmured, "beloved son and brother." Henry had been a friend, a confidant in his later years. "I miss you, Henry," he said, his voice cracking. "You made the days easier. I wish you were here." His words seemed to stir the air. A sudden chill swept through him, colder than the night. He looked around, the uneasy feeling growing. Shadows stretched toward him, long and unnatural. "Who's there?" he called, swinging the lantern. For a fleeting moment he thought he saw a figure, a tall, thin silhouette just beyond the light, but when he blinked, it was gone. The laughter came again, closer now, echoing among the stones. Panic seized him. He turned toward the gate, his pace quickening. Each step felt heavier, as if unseen eyes were watching, judging. The laughter swelled, louder and more malicious. He didn't dare look back. Reaching the gate, he stumbled through and collapsed onto the dirt road. Gasping, he turned back to the cemetery. It stood silent, yet he swore he saw shapes moving among the graves, lingering in the dark. His lantern flickered one last time before its flame died, leaving him in darkness. Clutching the lantern like a talisman, he whispered a prayer, but deep down, he knew the shadows had already noticed him. They were waiting. The old man sat trembling on his porch, the lantern cold in his hands. The night pressed down on him, heavy and suffocating. He stared at the dirt road leading to the cemetery, his eyes drawn to the shadows just beyond the porch light. They moved too deliberately to be swaying branches or drifting mist, yet he couldn't bring himself to believe what he was seeing. The whispers still clung to him, the laughter, faint and mocking. He rose from his chair and paced the porch, the boards groaning underfoot. Each step felt like an invitation to the unseen eyes he knew were watching. Inside, the house wasn't much better. Shadows huddled in corners and stretched unnaturally across the walls. He lit every lamp trying to banish them, but the glow only seemed to amplify his unease. Every flicker of light cast strange, darting shapes in the corners of his vision. Sinking into his armchair, he clutched a worn photograph. In it, 4 young boys stood shoulder to shoulder, grinning wide: Thomas, Liam, Henry, and himself. "I didn't mean to disturb you," he muttered to the shadows. "I only wanted to remember." The photograph slipped from his fingers as a low vibration hummed through the room. It wasn't a sound, exactly, but something he could feel, like a distant heartbeat. He froze, his breath catching as the vibration grew louder. The shadows along the walls began to writhe. They stretched and shifted, dark shapes twisting upward like smoke. He blinked hard, hoping it was a trick of the light, but the shadows didn't stop. One detached itself from the wall, standing tall and human-like. Its shape was wrong. Featureless, its edges rippling like water. "Who's there?" he croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. The shadow didn't answer. It moved closer, slow and deliberate, its presence pressing down on him like a weight. As it advanced, other shadows peeled themselves free, forming shapes that filled the room. Each one felt strangely familiar. They moved with an eerie cadence, tilting their heads as if listening. He stumbled backward, bumping into the table. The lantern clattered to the floor, rolling to the shadow's feet. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "It's not possible." The nearest shadow stopped. For a moment, faint glimmers of light seemed to form eyes within its inky darkness. Sad, accusing eyes. His knees buckled and he fell to the floor. The pulse grew deafening, pounding in his ears as the shadows pressed closer, their presence overwhelming. "You're not real," he gasped, though the words rang hollow. The shadows froze suddenly, and the vibration stopped. Silence engulfed the room. Then, as though obeying an unseen command, the shadows retreated. One by one they sank back into the walls, leaving only stillness. The old man lay there, trembling, his chest heaving. The house was quiet again, save for the faint creaks of the floorboards. He didn't trust the silence. It felt alive, waiting. He crawled to retrieve the lantern and clutched it tightly, but he didn't dare light it. The darkness around him was terrifying, but what the light might reveal was worse. Huddled against the wall, he stared into the empty room. He knew the shadows weren't gone. They were watching, waiting. And when they returned, he wouldn't be ready. The old man barely slept that night, haunted by shadows writhing beneath his eyelids. When dawn crept through the window, he rose stiffly, clutching the lantern. His body ached, but he ignored it. He needed answers. In his study, he opened a drawer to retrieve an old journal, its pages yellowed with age. It had belonged to Thomas, one of the friends whose grave he'd visited. Flipping through the pages, he felt the weight of memories he'd tried to bury. Thomas had always led them into mischief, his charisma unmatched. But the journal revealed something darker. The pages spoke of a pact, sealed beneath an ancient oak tree. Blood, symbols, and whispered words bound them together as boys. At the time, it had seemed innocent, a game to cement their friendship, but Thomas's writing revealed otherwise. The old man read aloud, his voice trembling. "We promised to stay together, always, but it was more than a promise. It was a bond." The final entry froze him. Thomas had dreamt of a dark figure watching from the woods. Breaking the bond, he wrote, would awaken it. "You can't leave. It won't let you." Shoving the journal aside, the old man felt a chill creep through him. Memories rushed back, carefree days that ended with time pulling them apart. He thought the pact had been forgotten. Now he wasn't so sure. The shadows in the room deepened, as if alive, listening. He gripped the lantern tighter, its cold metal grounding him. "I need to go back," he whispered, though the thought filled him with dread. The cemetery held answers, and he couldn't rest until he found them. Bundling up, he stepped outside. The daylight was pale and cold, offering little comfort. Shadows stretched unnaturally across the frozen ground as he walked the dirt road. His breath fogged the air, each exhale a reminder of how fragile he felt. At the cemetery gates, dread clawed at his chest. The air felt sharper here, the silence oppressive. He pushed the gate open, its rusty hinges groaning. The gravestones seemed taller, their inscriptions blurred, as though time had warped them. He followed the path to where his friends rested, the ground beneath his boots unnervingly soft. Stopping in front of Thomas's grave, he set the lantern down. "I'm here," he said aloud, his voice unsteady. "I broke the pact, but I didn't understand what it meant. Please, help me." Nothing happened at first. Then the air turned frigid. Frost crept along the ground and the lantern's glass cracked with a sharp ping. Shadows began to shift, coiling around the gravestones. A low whisper rose, indistinct but growing louder until it seemed to echo from all directions. The shadows converged, forming a shape, a tall, featureless figure with glowing eyes that burned like embers. The old man stumbled back, his heart pounding as the figure loomed over him. "You left us," it rasped, though its mouth never moved. The voice came from everywhere at once. "You broke what could not be broken." "I didn't know," the old man cried, falling to his knees. "We were just children. It wasn't real." The figure leaned closer, its fiery eyes boring into him. "It is real. And now you will understand." The shadows surged forward, enveloping him. The last thing he saw was the face of someone he once called a friend, twisted with betrayal. The world around the old man was swallowed by darkness. He didn't know how long he had been unconscious, but when he opened his eyes, the cemetery was unrecognizable. The moonlight was gone, replaced by an unnatural glow from the gravestones. Shadows flickered like flames in a silent wind. His head throbbed as he pulled himself upright, his fingers digging into the frozen ground. The shattered lantern lay beside him, its broken glass catching the eerie light. He muttered a curse, feeling the chill seep into his bones. He wanted to flee, but his legs refused to move. "You should not have come back," a voice rasped. It wasn't the shadowy figure from before, but something smaller, crouched atop a gravestone nearby. The creature was humanoid but twisted, its limbs bent unnaturally. Its faintly glowing eyes burned beneath the shadows. The old man's voice cracked. "What? What do you want from me?" The creature tilted its head. "We want what was promised," it said, its voice layered with echoes. "You broke the bond. Now the debt must be paid." "I didn't know," the old man stammered. "We were children. It wasn't real." "Real enough to summon us," the creature replied, crawling down from the gravestone with unsettling grace. Its movements were fluid, like liquid shadow melting and reforming. "You abandoned the others. You left them alone when they needed you most." The old man's chest tightened, memories flashing through his mind. He had left. They had all gone their separate ways, but he had been the first to break their pact. He had convinced himself it didn't matter, that it was just childhood nonsense. Now, the weight of those choices bore down on him. "I want to make it right," he pleaded. "I'll do whatever it takes." The creature paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "The living cannot undo the sins of the past, but perhaps you can survive them." Before the old man could respond, the ground beneath him shifted. He scrambled backward as a fissure split the earth, revealing a chasm of writhing darkness below. Shadows spilled out, their shapes shifting, forming figures both familiar and alien. They circled him, whispering in voices he recognized. Thomas, Liam, Henry, all mingled with anger and betrayal. "You left us," the whispers accused. "You left us to face it alone." Tears streamed down the old man's face as he fell to his knees. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. "I didn't know." The creature watched, its expression unreadable. "Regret is meaningless now," it said. "But there is a path forward, if you are willing to walk it." "What do you mean?" the old man asked, his voice trembling. The creature gestured toward the chasm. "Enter, and face what lies within. Only then will you understand the price of betrayal." The old man stared into the abyss, the shadows twisting and writhing as if alive. The whispers grew louder, pulling at his mind. Every instinct screamed at him to run, but he knew there was no escape. This was the path he had chosen. Taking a shaky breath, he stood. His legs wobbled, but he forced himself forward. With each step toward the chasm, the shadows parted, making way for him. The air grew colder, the whispers louder, until they became a deafening roar. At the edge of the abyss, he hesitated, looking back at the creature. Its glowing eyes burned into him. "You seek answers," it said. "This is the only way." Swallowing his fear, the old man stepped into the darkness. The ground gave way beneath him, and he fell, the whispers consuming him as the shadows closed in. The old man plunged into the abyss, weightless as shadows engulfed him. The whispers surged, voices familiar and foreign, wrapping around him like chains. He reached for something solid, but there was nothing. Only the endless fall and crushing weight of the voices. "You broke us," they hissed. "You forgot us." The descent ended abruptly. He hit the ground, gasping. Beneath him, the ash-like ground shifted. The air reeked of decay. As he steadied himself, his surroundings came into focus. He was in a cavern, its walls alive with flickering shadows. They writhed like living things, forming figures he recognized. Thomas, Liam, Henry, all stared at him with hollow, accusing eyes. "You left us," they said in unison, their voices echoing. "We trusted you, and you abandoned us." The old man shook his head, tears streaking his face. "I didn't mean to," he whispered. "Life pulled us apart. I thought we'd find our way back." The shadows surged forward, their forms elongating. The faces of his friends twisted into grotesque masks of anger and sorrow. "You broke the bond," they said. "You chose yourself over us." He stumbled back, raising his hands. "Please," he begged. "I didn't understand. Tell me how to make it right." The shadows paused. One stepped forward, its form stabilizing. It was Thomas, or what was left of him. His eyes burned coldly, his mouth twisted into a grim smile. "There is no forgiveness here," Thomas said. "Only truth." The ground shifted beneath him, and a circle of light appeared in the distance. It pulsed faintly, drawing his gaze. "What is that?" he asked. "The center of the bond," Thomas replied. "The truth you buried. Go to it, if you dare." Summoning courage, the old man took a step toward the light. The shadows parted reluctantly, their whispers softer but no less menacing. Each step felt heavier, the air turning icy as he approached. When he reached the light, he saw a stone altar etched with the symbols they had carved as boys. Dried blood stained the grooves. He touched it, and a surge of energy coursed through him, pulling him into a memory. He was a boy again, standing beneath the old oak tree with his friends. They laughed as they carved the symbols. But something lingered, something watching. He remembered the way the wind stilled, how the forest held its breath. "We're friends forever," young Thomas had said solemnly, "no matter what." The memory shifted to years later. He saw himself leaving. His friends begged him to stay, but he ignored them. He convinced himself they'd move on, that the pact was a game. Yet as he walked away, he felt it, the weight of something breaking. The vision ended. He was back in the cavern, the altar glowing faintly. The shadows pressed closer. "You knew," Thomas said. "Even then, you knew." The old man sank to his knees, guilt crushing him. "I didn't want to believe it," he admitted. "I was scared." The shadows loomed over him. "Fear does not absolve you," they said. "The bond was life itself, and you shattered it. Now, face what you've created." The altar cracked, and from its depths something rose, a writhing mass, shifting endlessly. It radiated a power that froze him in place. "This is your creation," the shadows whispered, "the embodiment of your betrayal." The old man stared at the creature, his heart pounding. "What do I do?" he asked. The shadows offered no answer. The creature lunged, and the cavern was consumed by darkness. The darkness swallowed the old man as the creature lunged. He felt its weight crushing him, the whispers growing into screams. He clawed at the void, desperate to escape, but there was only endless black. Then the weight lifted. Gasping, he opened his eyes. He was no longer in the cavern. Around him stretched an endless gray expanse. The whispers lingered, softer now. He stumbled to his feet. In the distance, a faint glow flickered like a candle in the wind. Compelled by an unseen force, he walked toward it. The ground shifted with every step, unsteady yet urging him forward. The glow grew stronger, revealing a boy, himself, but younger. The boy looked up, his wide eyes filled with sadness. "You forgot me," the boy said, his voice quiet. "You left us behind." The old man's throat tightened. "I didn't mean to," he said. "I thought it was just a game." "It wasn't a game," the boy replied. "You made a promise." The glow around the boy shifted. He pointed into the distance where 3 figures stood. They were his friends, Thomas, Liam, and Henry. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow. "Go to them," the boy said. "They're waiting for you." Taking a deep breath, the old man walked toward the figures. The whispers swelled with every step, deafening by the time he reached them. The 3 figures turned. Then Thomas stepped forward, his expression cold. "You broke the pact," Thomas said. "You chose yourself over us." The old man dropped to his knees. "I didn't know," he said. "I didn't understand." "You knew enough to leave," Liam said bitterly. "I'm sorry," the old man whispered. "I'm so sorry." Henry's voice broke the silence. "Sorry isn't enough. The bond can't be repaired, but it can be released." The old man looked up, hope flickering. "How?" Thomas pointed to the ground where a faint outline of an altar appeared, glowing. "You started this. You must finish it." The old man crawled to the altar, his hands shaking. The carved symbols glowed faintly, power pulsing beneath his fingers. "What do I do?" he asked. "Give it what it wants," Thomas said. "It demands a price." The old man's breath hitched. "What price?" "The bond was life," Henry said. "It demands life to be undone." The old man looked at the altar, then at his friends. "If I do this, will you be free?" "We don't know," Liam said, "but it's the only way." Closing his eyes, the old man placed his hands on the altar. Its glow intensified, enveloping him. The whispers wrapped around him like a shroud. "Take it," he whispered. "Take what you need." The light surged and the world dissolved into nothingness. The old man awoke to silence. His body trembled with exhaustion, but he felt lighter. He blinked, disoriented as dim light illuminated his surroundings. He was in a forest, a hauntingly familiar one. The ancient oak tree loomed ahead, its twisted branches clawing at the sky. The air was heavy, the whispers gone. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots crunching on dry leaves. The tree shifted in the dim light, its bark writhing as though alive. "You returned," a voice said. He spun around. Thomas stood behind him, pale but solid, the boy he remembered. "Where are we?" the old man asked. Thomas gestured toward the oak. "Where it began, where the pact was made, and where it must end." The old man turned to the tree. Its roots twisted deep into the earth and glowing symbols carved into its bark bled sap. "I gave it what it wanted," the old man said. "Isn't it over?" Thomas stepped closer. "The bond isn't just yours. It's all of ours. And it's still broken." The old man's breath caught. "What do I do?" Thomas pointed to a jagged opening at the tree's base. Go inside. Face it. Fear rooted him in place, but he knew there was no turning back. Taking a deep breath, he approached. The air hummed with energy, the opening pulsing faintly. Inside, the world shifted. He stood in the dusty clubhouse where they had planned their pact. The air smelled of candle wax and the table was cluttered with knives and scraps of paper. Young Thomas, Liam, and Henry sat around the table laughing, but the mood darkened. The boys grew quiet as the candles flickered. His younger self hesitated, a knife poised over the symbols they were carving. "Do you think it's real?" young Liam whispered. "It doesn't matter," young Thomas said. "It's our promise. That makes it real." The old man wanted to shout, but he was frozen. He watched as they sealed their pact, blood mingling on an altar of stones. The air shifted, charged with unseen power. The memory fractured, and he was back in the tree's hollow. Shadows twisted around him, the whispers returning louder. "You left us," the voices accused. "You broke the bond." "I know," the old man shouted. "I failed you, but I'm here now. Tell me how to fix it." The shadows surged but softened. His friends emerged, not as shadows but as boys. They surrounded him, solemn. "It's not just the pact," Thomas said. "You ran away. We faced it alone. That's the wound that never healed." "I can't undo what I did," the old man said, "but I'll do anything to make it right." Thomas placed a hand on his shoulder. "You have to remember, not just what we did, but why. That's the only way to set us free." The shadows receded as light filled the hollow. A truth stirred within him, buried long ago. As the light grew brighter, he knew the end was near. The old man felt the world dissolving around him. The light intensified, swallowing the hollow of the tree and his friends' faces. Yet there was no fear, only calm. He was no longer falling or standing, but suspended in a place that was everywhere and nowhere. From the light, a figure emerged. Not his friends, not himself. It was the essence of the pact they had forged, a shifting, fluid entity that dissolved and reformed endlessly. Its voice echoed, layered and eternal. "You understand now," it said. "The bond was more than a promise. It was a tether, to each other, to this place, to the life you shared." The old man nodded, his voice steady. "I broke it when I chose to leave. I let fear guide me. But I want to fix it. What must I do?" The entity's form twisted, its light dimming momentarily. "To restore balance, all bonds must be severed. The weight of the pact cannot be undone by one life alone. It requires all." The old man's heart sank. "All? My friends too?" "Yes," the entity said, its tone heavy with finality. "They remain bound, as you are. To release them, you must sacrifice what remains of your shared life." The old man thought of his friends, Thomas's confidence, Liam's humor, Henry's loyalty. He had clung to those memories even as he ran from the pact. They were fragments of joy that had never faded. "What happens to them?" he asked. "If the bond is severed?" "They will find peace," the entity replied, "and so will you." The old man closed his eyes. The weight of his guilt pressed down, but this time it didn't crush him. He had spent so long running, clinging to fragments of what once was. Now he understood. Freedom required letting go. "I'm ready," he said. The entity raised an arm and the light pulsed. Then, "Let it be done." The bond tightened one last time, connecting him to his friends, the tree, and the world they had created. Memories of laughter, fights, and promises flooded his mind, but instead of pain, there was warmth. The light grew brighter, enveloping him completely. He sensed his friends around him, not as shadows, but as the boys they had been, full of life and hope. They were laughing, their voices a chorus of innocence and joy. "Thank you," Thomas's voice said, everywhere and nowhere. for bringing us home." The old man smiled, tears streaming. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for everything." The bond snapped. In an instant, the weight lifted. The light dimmed, and he found himself standing alone at the oak tree's base. The forest was quiet, bathed in golden glow. The symbols had vanished. The bark no longer bled. He looked up at the sky, where dawn painted the horizon. For the first time in decades, he felt truly free. His friends were gone, but they were no longer trapped. They had found peace, and so had he. The old man knelt at the roots of the tree, his hand resting on its bark. "Goodbye," he said softly. Then, with a deep breath, he stood and began to walk away, the morning light guiding his path. The old man walked away from the oak tree, his steps heavy with finality. The morning light painted the forest in gold, but the silence around him felt unnatural. Though the whispers were gone, their absence was louder than sound. He glanced back at the tree one last time. The pact was broken, yet he felt unfinished. The path ahead was unfamiliar, winding through dense trees that closed in around him. The golden light faded, replaced by shadows. The air grew colder, and the calm he had felt began to dissolve. "You're not done," a voice whispered ahead. It wasn't like the whispers from before. This one was sharp and distinct. He froze, searching for the source, but the forest was empty. "I broke the bond," he said aloud. "I gave everything." The path twisted unnaturally, trees bending as if alive, their branches stretching toward him. The air grew heavier, and the ground pulsed beneath his feet. Reluctantly, he followed the path. At last, he reached a clearing. In its center stood a boy, himself, younger and untouched by guilt. The boy looked at him, his face pale but serene. "You forgot something," the boy said. The old man frowned. "What? I've done everything." "You let go of the bond, but not the truth. The pact wasn't the only thing you ran from." The clearing dissolved. Trees and earth faded into mist, and the boy disappeared. When the mist cleared, the old man stood in his childhood bedroom, watching his younger self sit on the bed, holding something in his hands. It was a photo, one of his friends, smiling and carefree. He remembered this moment. It was the day he decided to leave, the weight of responsibility too much to bear. His younger self tore the photo in two, as if severing his connection to the past would free him. "Why did you do it?" a voice asked. Thomas stood in the doorway, his face shadowed. "I had no choice," the old man said, though the words felt hollow. "You always had a choice," Thomas said, "but you chose yourself." The room dissolved, and he was back in the clearing. The boy returned, holding the torn photo. He held it out, his expression expectant. "You can't move forward until you face this," the boy said. The old man reached for the photo, his hands trembling. As his fingers touched it, memories overwhelmed him. His friends' laughter, their faces on the day he left. The weight of guilt was crushing, but for the first time, he didn't turn away. He let the pain wash over him, felt the full weight of his choices. "I'm sorry," he whispered, "for running, for forgetting." The boy nodded, his form beginning to fade. "Now you can let go." The forest shifted, shadows lifted, and the golden light returned. The old man stood alone in the clearing, the torn photo whole and unmarked in his hands. He tucked it into his coat and turned back to the path, his steps lighter. The journey was nearing its end. For the first time, he felt ready to face what awaited. The forest opened before the old man, the golden light growing brighter with every step. The air became warmer, and the oppressive weight he had carried for so long began to fade. Yet, as the path stretched forward, he sensed the journey was far from over. This was not the end. It was the threshold. Ahead, a clearing emerged, bathed in ethereal light. In the center stood a familiar sight, The altar, now whole and untouched, its surface unmarked by time or decay. Around it stood his friends, Thomas, Liam, and Henry. They appeared as they once had, young and vibrant, their eyes filled with an unearthly glow. The old man approached, his steps slow and deliberate. The clearing was silent, but the air was charged with something powerful, something final. "You made it," Thomas said, his voice calm and steady. "We didn't think you'd come this far." The old man stopped before them, his gaze shifting between their faces. "I couldn't leave it undone," he said. "Not again." Liam stepped forward, his usual quiet humor replaced by a solemn expression. "This is the last step," he said. "You face the bond, the truth. Now you must face yourself." The altar pulsed with light, its surface shimmering. The old man turned to it, his reflection staring back at him from its glowing surface. For the first time, he saw himself not as the boy who had run, nor the old man burdened by guilt, but something in between, someone trying to make amends. "What do I have to do?" he asked, his voice steady. Henry spoke, his tone gentle but firm. "The bond has been severed, but its echoes remain. To truly set us free, you must offer the one thing you've held on to, the pain." The old man hesitated, the weight of their words sinking in. He had carried his guilt for so long, it had become a part of him. Letting it go felt as terrifying as holding on to it. "What happens if I do?" he asked. "You'll be free," Thomas said, "and so will we." The old man stepped closer to the altar. Its light grew warmer, enveloping him in a cocoon of energy. Memories surfaced, his friends laughing beneath the oak tree, their voices echoing with promises of forever. The day he left, their faces filled with confusion and pain, the decades of silence, the ache of regret. "I'm sorry," he whispered, placing his hands on the altar, "for all of it." The light surged, and the world around him shifted. The clearing disappeared, replaced by a vast, endless horizon. He was alone, yet he felt the presence of his friends all around him. Their voices, once filled with anger and sadness, were now calm, at peace. "Thank you," they said, their words a soft echo, "for remembering." The old man opened his eyes to find himself standing at the edge of the forest. The altar, the clearing, and the light were gone. In their place was a quiet path leading toward the rising sun. He felt lighter than he ever had, as if the burden of his past had truly been lifted. For the first time in decades, he smiled. Not a smile of relief or resignation, but one of hope. His journey was over, but the life ahead was just beginning. With a steady breath, he stepped onto the path, the sunlight guiding him forward.